Hi, welcome back to ENMU Reads. My name's Dr. Richard Allington. I'm a professor of history here at Easton, and wanted to welcome you to this lecture I'm going to give you this afternoon on the Age of Discovery. Now, the Age of Discovery marks a fundamental shift in the history of the world. It marks a fundamental shift in the role of Western civilization within the world. And it's a change that's made possible in large part due to a culture of learning and studying. And so that's why I thought this would be a particularly appropriate topic to talk about to you this afternoon. So we're going to start with this map of the world around 1400 or so. And what I'd like you to recognize in particular is how relatively small and insignificant Europe, or what we would call Western civilization, is at this time. We have much larger, much wealthier, much more sophisticated societies in other continents around the globe. And we are used to thinking about our modern world as a world that's dominated by Western civilization. But around 1400 or so, that was not so much the case. That's going to change. That's going to change in a way that places European civilization, European ideas at the forefront in influencing the history of the world. And the Age of Discovery is going to be the main player in that shift taking place, at least in that shift beginning. So now we're going to move to another picture. This picture shows us what are known as the Pillars of Hercules. This is the Rock of Gibraltar that's on the northern side of the Mediterranean, northern coast at the edge of the Mediterranean. This is a part of Morocco that sticks out into the Mediterranean opposite the Rock of Gibraltar. And so these promontories, these outcrops of land, stand on the edge of the Mediterranean, looking out into the Atlantic, looking out into the west. And the legend was that the demigod Hercules, at the end of his labors, placed these pillars, if you want to call them pillars, these pillars of earth here at the edge of the Mediterranean as a warning to seafarers not to pass the Pillars of Hercules. That beyond the Pillars of Hercules lay dangerous seas that were too dangerous for human beings to navigate. That beyond the Pillars of Hercules were monsters of the seas, the realm of the gods, and somewhere where human beings probably shouldn't go. And in the main, this was respected. This was respected for much of the ancient and medieval history of Europe. Although we do begin to see that there are shipwrecks along the west coast of Africa in the 1200s. So that suggests to us that Europeans are beginning to move beyond the Mediterranean. They're starting to explore what's going on in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, at this time, for most people, knowledge of sub-Saharan Africa was virtually non-existent. Even an understanding of the shape of the African continent was virtually non-existent and was left up to supposition. The one group of people in the world who Europeans felt might have a sense of what the world looked like beyond the Mediterranean were Arab traders, traders who were coming across North Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. So we find that in the 12th century, so in the 1100s, the king of Sicily asks an Arab geographer, so someone who's talking to these Arab traders, to make him a map of the world. And this was the map that he produced. And so it's interesting because there are some parts of it, like Arabia, that are pretty similar in shape and in size to what we would expect to see on a map of the world today. But then there are other parts, such as when we get into northern Europe, that's a long way from Arabia, where it doesn't look very similar to an accurate map of the world today. And we can see that there's this understanding of Africa, that Africa is kind of a mirror continent to Asia, and the Indian Ocean is kind of a mirror sea to the Mediterranean. And this was the supposition that people had at the time, that the Earth was in some way symmetrical, and that therefore that the shape of the African continent was from west to east, rather than from north to south. Of course, North and South America are nowhere to be seen. when we think about the age of exploration, a lot of times people turn to this formula of God, gold, and glory. That people pursued exploration, they pursued exploring new lands out of a desire to spread Christianity, out of a desire for wealth, and out of a desire for personal prestige. And this is a glib formula. It's something that's easy for people to recite and to remember. It gets at a lot of the basic points. But what I'd like to suggest for you today is that there is a lot more to the age of discovery than simply this three-word formula. There's a lot more about what it means to be human, what human beings are capable of achieving, and there's a lot more simply than gold that's at stake. Just to take one of these names, one of these reasons that's given. We know now that most people who went on these expeditions, that probably, because the expeditions took a long time, they would have made as much money if they'd gone on a shorter expedition, and they'd gone on a number of shorter expeditions than on one very long expedition where you don't know the resources, you don't know the success of the expedition. So there's something going on here that's more than just a search for wealth and a search for glory and efforts to evangelize other nations and other peoples. There's a question here about why human beings take risks. Why is it that human beings put themselves in dangerous situations? Why is it that human beings want to explore new areas? And so I'd invite you to think about these questions, to think about the answers, possible answers to these questions as we investigate this change that's taking place in the position of European society in the world. And so first we have to think about medieval Europe. We have to think about the society in which the age of discovery emerged. Oftentimes we tend to think of medieval Europe as a very closed-minded and a very bigoted age, when the citizens of medieval Europe were most interested in themselves and their own beliefs and saw any other cultures, any other beliefs as very threatening. Now, it's certainly true that medieval Europeans were suspicious of some of the other cultures and beliefs that they encountered outside of their own society. But it's also true that they were fascinated by many of the others. We see this in the example of the Vikings. Vikings are these great travelers who come to Europe, who travel through Europe. They bring a lot of violence with them as well, at least initially, but they're certainly interested in these other parts of Europe that they want to explore. And they're interested in the North African coast that they explore as well. We see this in medieval culture in a fascination with pilgrimages, that people are constantly traveling to new places, they're constantly traveling to holy sites, that this is seen as one of the most important things that people in this society can do. And of course, most famously, we see this in the Crusades, that the Crusades are these religious expeditions that Europeans carry out where they travel from Europe to the Middle East. And they do this for religious reasons. But an interesting byproduct of the Crusades is that along with these religious wars, we find we find the Europeans exposed to other cultures, exposed to Middle Eastern cultures, exposed to Central Asian cultures, and that medieval Europe continues to develop a fascination with these cultures. So this brings us to the 1200s now. So we looked at a map, what Europeans thought the world looked like in the 1200s. Now we come to the 1200s. The 1200s are famous in world history for the creation of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols create this enormous empire that spans most of Eurasia, from Mongolia, that's up around here, all through China, all through Central Asia and modern Afghanistan and Iran, and to the edge of the Middle East. And these conquests are very traumatic for those who come in the way of the Mongol army or try and resist the Mongol army. But the Mongols are not just conquerors, they're also traders and merchants, and they're very successful traders and merchants. One of the legacies of this empire they create, or one of the consequences of this empire that they create, is that they expose the Europeans to the possibilities of trade beyond the Middle East. So up until this point, local rulers, local Islamic rulers in the Middle East have been very suspicious of Christian traders who wanted to move further east into Asia, even if it was just for reasons of trading. With the Mongols, we see less of that suspicion. Instead, we see the Mongols encouraging medieval Christians to travel to the Far East and to carry out trade in these regions. The most famous European who does this is Marco Polo. Marco Polo is famous because he travels to China. He not only travels to China, but when he comes back from China, he writes an account of his trip. And this account becomes the equivalent of a bestseller. Something that everyone wants to read. Everyone, even those who can't read, want to hear the stories from this account. And it encourages this fascination with this wealthy, sophisticated, foreign world that medieval Europeans are starting to discover. At the same time, the Europeans are also in growing need of supplies from other parts of the world. They're in need of spices for preservatives, as supplies of salt in Europe are running out. They're also in need of precious metal for currency. Precious metal supplies in Europe are also starting to run out. So at the same time as you have these very real material needs, you have a very real cultural fascination with other parts of the world that's becoming an important part of what it means to be European at this time. Alongside these factors, as we get into the 14th century, so now we're into the 1300s. 1200s, we looked at the map of what that looks like. 1100s, we looked at a map of what that looks like. 1200s, we looked at the Mongol Empire, how it's encouraging this interest in foreign cultures, and now we come to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is a huge topic, but how can we summarize that and get a sense of how it impacts the emergence of the Age of Discovery? The Renaissance is focused on rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman learning. And so there's a focus on the learning, on the knowledge of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations that have been lost for much of the Middle Ages and recovering that learning. At the same time, there's also an interest in individual human beings, which we call humanism. What is the greatest thing, what are individual human beings most capable of? And so these two things together, this interest in ancient texts and this interest in what human beings are capable of, combine together to form the Renaissance. And so you can probably see where this is headed at this point. We have the emergence of a culture that emphasizes discovering ancient texts, and that includes ancient geographical texts that theorize about the shape of the world, about the continents that are on the world, about how those continents are placed relative to one another. We also have an interest in individual human beings and the great deeds that human beings can do, the endeavors that human beings are capable of, the human spirit, and what the human spirit is capable of. And so these different factors together are going to encourage the Age of Discovery. On one hand, an interest in foreign cultures. On the other hand, an interest in individual human beings and their achievements, combined with ancient geographical theories. At the same time, there are very real challenges to European discovery that emerge at the same time. So in the 1300s, at the same time as you have the emergence of the Renaissance, this interest in the human individual, you also have a series of disasters and challenges that emerge that challenge European or Western civilization at this time. The first of these, of course, is the Black Death that you see depicted here. You see people dying from these swellings that would open up all over their bodies. And this is widely considered the greatest pandemic in history. So this brings about death and destruction. The death and destruction of the Black Death brings with it the end of the Mongol Empire. So the Mongol Empire, which had stretched all the way from the shores of the Mediterranean, all the way to the shores of the Pacific Ocean in China, that disintegrates. So you have a huge decline in population. It's no longer possible to maintain an empire of that size. The end of the Mongol Empire simultaneously brings an end to easy European access to Asia and the Middle East for trading. Now, instead of a single empire that's benefiting from long-distance trade and encouraging long-distance trade, now we have an empire, or we don't really have an empire at all. We have lots of little local rulers. Some of them are well disposed to merchants and traders and missionaries. Some of them are not. Some of them levy very heavy taxes on merchants and traders to pass through their lands. And so carrying out trade, if you're a medieval merchant, suddenly becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more dangerous. Now we move to the 1400s. Another challenge emerges. That's the rise of the Ottoman Empire, rise of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the Middle East. And in 1453, so now we're about 30, 39, 40 years away from Columbus. In 1453, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, conquers the city of Constantinople, which up until that point had been part of the Byzantine Empire. Now this was important because the city of Constantinople was basically a really important portal for medieval merchants to travel from the Mediterranean to parts of Asia and to carry out trade there. With the fall of Constantinople, that trade is no longer possible. The Ottomans are much more suspicious of Christian merchants and Christian missionaries, and so at the exact same time as everything in European culture is trending towards greater interest and greater interaction with a wider world, the eastern half of the Mediterranean becomes more closed to them than it has been for a number of centuries. So there are these very real challenges that medieval Europeans are facing at this time. Instead, the impetus for the European Age of Discovery, the expansion of European influence across the globe, comes from the western half of the Mediterranean, comes from Spain and Portugal. And so we again have a very long and complex history of medieval Spain. This graphic gives you some idea of what's going on here. We have an Arab Islamic invasion in the 700s, which takes over large parts of Spain, except for a small northern kingdom that remains Christian. And this small, relatively insignificant northern kingdom holds out. The Muslim rulers of southern Spain are not particularly interested in conquering this area. It's the poorest, the wildest area of Spain. They're not particularly interested in establishing it under their control. At the same time, over the next 700 years, you have ongoing cultural exchange between the Muslim-ruled parts of Spain and the Christian-ruled parts of northern Spain. Sometimes Muslims and Christians are fighting against one another. Sometimes different groups of Christians are fighting against one another. Sometimes different groups of Muslims are fighting against one another. It's a very complex situation. But the end result is that medieval Christians in Spain retain some kind of identity that's maybe not totally accurate, but they retain an identity and a memory of a united Christian Spain. They retain a goal of restoring this united Christian Spain. And over the next 7 centuries, at crisis moments, we find that the Christians tend to be more united, the Muslims tend to be more divided, and so gradually you can see 1150 looks like this, 1400 starts to look more like this. And so we can gradually see that the different Christian kingdoms are now dominating the peninsula. In 1469, so now we're 16 years after the fall of Constantinople, the eastern part of the Mediterranean is now very closed to European interaction beyond the bounds of the Mediterranean. We have the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel, who were the rulers of the 2 most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain. Ferdinand, who ruled this region over here, and Isabel, who ruled this region here. And Ferdinand and Isabel are going to make the restoration of this memory of a united Christian Spain a central part of their identity as the rulers of Spain. And they are going to take conscious action to complete the reconquest or the restoration of Spain. And in 1492, they are going to complete the conquest of this last southern part of Spain that's still remained in Muslim hands. So now you've re-established a relatively united Christian Spain, or Christian-ruled Spain. There's also the Christian Kingdom of Portugal over here that we're going to come to a little later. What are the effects of this conquest? The effects are that now, as we come to the end of the 15th century, as we come to the end of the 1400s, there is a powerful new Christian kingdom on the western edge of the Mediterranean that's going to be looking to expand its influence, to expand its interaction with the rest of the world, and it's going to be looking south and west in order to do so. And so this is going to provide a lot of the political energy, a lot of the military power for the age of discovery to be possible. That's going to be combined with a lot of the knowledge, the theoretical knowledge about geography that's coming out of Italy with the Renaissance. And the explorers are also going to be supported by other new technological developments that are taking place at this time. I've just chosen two of them to highlight here. The first of these on the left is called the astrolabe. It is a navigational instrument that was developed by Jewish astronomers in Baghdad in the Middle Ages. We find that the astrolabe makes it much easier to measure your latitude. Now, with the use of this instrument, explorers, navigators, captains are much more capable of measuring how far north, how far south they are. It's far less difficult to get lost. Sorry, it's far more difficult to get lost. Over here, we have a new type of ship that's called the caravel. The Mediterranean, which Europeans were most used to sailing on, is a very calm sea. There are no tides, and so if you go down to the beach and you build your sandcastle, you can come back the next day. Your sandcastle will still be there, won't have been washed away by the tide. If you're navigating the Mediterranean, it's also very easy to stay close to land. And so up until this point, we haven't really seen Europeans with a desire to advance their shipbuilding techniques that much. They're sailing in galleys that are largely powered by oars that look very similar to the type of ships that the ancient Greeks and Romans were using. But around this time, we see the development of this new ship called the caravel. See that this ship is going to rely heavily on the use of sails in order to travel. And that this is a new type of rigging. So the way these sails are aligned, the way they're raised, it makes it far easier for this style of ship to sail close to the wind. This means that these ships are going to be able to travel much further, much faster. They're going to be able to hold a much smaller crew, and therefore they're much better suited to long-distance voyages. And so these two technological developments in particular, along with greater knowledge of the geography of the world, greater interest in the geography of the world, are going to be the tools, along with the increased power of Christian kingdoms in Portugal and Spain, that are going to make the age of discovery possible. So now we're going to turn to some exploring. We're going to turn first to the Kingdom of Portugal. Why is it that the age of discovery begins in Portugal? We've just been talking about Spain. Spain is going to become very important. But we're going to begin with the Kingdom of Portugal. The Kingdom of Portugal, that by around 1250 or so, we're just going to wait for the lights to come back here. Okay, we're all good. So by around 1250 or so, the Portuguese had completed the restoration of their historic kingdom. They now had no need to travel or no need to fight beyond their borders in Spain against Christian rivals or Muslim rivals. And there isn't a whole lot of places for them to go. And so they start to look to expand their influence outside of Europe. And first they turn their attention to Africa. They try and establish an empire to control territory in North Africa. So at the beginning of the 1400s, the Portuguese had staged a surprise assault on the city of Ceuta that you see here. And the city is captured. And so for the Portuguese, this seems to be the beginning of their African empire. They quickly discover, however, that the local rulers of Africa are too powerful for the Portuguese to conquer. And one of the brothers, one of the sons of the king who had organized this expedition, actually ends up getting captured. He gets captured and enslaved, and the ruler who had captured him said, "We'll release him if you'll give up this city." And the Portuguese said, "No, we're not going to negotiate with you," and this young prince died in slavery. This seems to have left a profound impression on the prince's older brother. The prince's older brother named Henry, who had become known to history as Henry the Navigator. So what does Henry do? Henry builds a library. Henry builds a library in which he establishes and brings together all the latest tools and treatises for learning about geography and learning about travel. It's a place where explorers can go to study all the maps that are available, and this becomes a center for exploration and the study of exploration. So again, we have the culture of the library here, which is going to be central to the development of the Age of Discovery. And so now the Portuguese, they give up their dreams of a land-based empire across North Africa. This is actually one of the interesting aspects of the history of the Age of Discovery, one of the most interesting aspects of the history of the Age of Discovery, that the African kingdoms were too powerful for the European nations to conquer. We tend to ask, why is it that the Europeans had to go all the way to the Americas to create empires? It was because the African kingdoms were too powerful. And so we find that the Portuguese begin to explore the coast of Africa. And this map is relatively quite small detail, but maybe you can blow it up on your screens. And you can see the different dates of the different expeditions here. You can see the Portuguese are gradually making their way further and further south. But you can see as well that this exploration isn't an exploration of conquest. Instead, it's an exploration of trade. The Portuguese are establishing trading relationships and connections along the coast of Africa. They're establishing these small enclaves of territory where they can do business with the local rulers without coming into conflict. And the Portuguese gradually move further and further south, until in 1488, one of the explorers named Bartholomew Diaz, is going to cross into the Indian Ocean for the first time. So we're told that Diaz and his crew are in a storm off the coast of Africa. They're in a storm, everything goes dark, just like it did here just now, and then the seas are wild, they have no idea where they are. When they come out of the storm, they find that the land is on the other side. And it takes them a while to realize what's happened, and eventually they realize that this must mean that they finally rounded the tip of Africa. Think back to that very early map of the world as Europeans thought it looked in the 1100s. They thought Africa ended up here. So they've spent the last 20 years or so waiting to reach the tip of the coast of Africa. They finally made it round. And Bartholomew Diaz is really excited. He says, we have to carry on to the lands of Marco Polo in the east. And his crew say, enough is enough. It's very dangerous, it's very scary, our world's been turned upside down, we're going to go back to Portugal. About 10 years later, another explorer, Vasco da Gama, is going to go further. He's going to go follow the route of Bartholomew Diaz, he's going to round the coast of southern Africa, and he's going to come to Mozambique, right here. And the Europeans pull into this port of Mozambique. And they need supplies. They're looking for a pilot who will take them to Asia. Just look at some pictures here. This is the tip of Africa. So this is Bartholomew Diaz, 1488. He's in these waters rounding the southern edge of Africa. When Vasco da Gama and his crew arrive in the port of Mozambique, they are shocked. They are shocked because they discover that the ship that they are sailing in is the smallest and the scruffiest ship in the harbour. They discover that they have stumbled on a trading network between East Africa and India and Arabia that has been going on quite peacefully without them for centuries. And the ships that these different regions of the world are using to carry out this trade are far bigger. The sailors who are manning them are far more competent than they are. And so this is very surprising for the Portuguese. They're being confronted with a larger world than they knew existed. And so Vasco da Gama and his crew, they find a pilot, someone to help them, and someone who guides them to the shores of India. The first Europeans to make it to the shores of India using this seaward route. They return home after a voyage of 3 years. Remember, they would have had no communication with anyone at home during this time. And they come back with an awareness of how much bigger the world is than they had realized, and with just a renewed fascination to be involved in this world and to be engaged with these different societies that they're coming in contact with. Okay, so this is the achievement of the Portuguese. Round the coast of Africa, reach India, establish a network of trade across these different regions, which is going to make them very wealthy and very successful. Back to the Spanish now. Back to the Spanish and the arrival, emergence of Christopher Columbus. So it's 1492. Ferdinand and Isabel have completed their restoration of the United Kingdom of Spain. They're looking for the opportunities for this new, powerful Christian kingdom to exercise its influence around the world. And they find themselves confronted by this man, Christopher Columbus, who is proposing or seeking funds to explore an alternative route to Asia by sailing directly west. And Christopher Columbus had proposed this idea to basically all the courts of Europe at this time. And he had been turned down every step of the way. He'd even been turned down by the Portuguese. The Portuguese, who we know at this point, they rarely turn down anyone who wants to go on an expedition, wants to be exploring, wants to use Henry the Navigator's library. Why is it that the Portuguese turned Christopher Columbus down? It is not, and it's important to remember this, it's not because they thought that the world was flat. On the contrary, they knew that the world was round. They were very confident, at least, that the world was round. But they also knew that Christopher Columbus's math was wrong. They had no knowledge of these two great continents, halfway between, or less than halfway between, Europe and Asia. They knew about China, they knew about the dimensions of the world. They had a far more accurate idea of the dimensions of the world than we tend to give them credit for, and certainly than Columbus had. And so, not knowing about the existence of North and South America, they said, if you set out on this expedition, you'll run out of provisions, you'll run out of water, you'll run out of food, long before you reach Asia, and we're not going to waste money on these foolhardy ideas. Ferdinand and Isabel are in a slightly different position, however. They haven't been engaged in this culture of discovery and exploration in the same way that the Portuguese have. And they're also trying to make up for lost time. They realize that they're behind the Portuguese. And so they're more willing to take a chance on Columbus, to give him his 3 famous ships and encourage him to attempt this voyage. And so Columbus sets off on this voyage, this historic voyage. And he soon realizes himself that his math was wrong. He soon realizes himself that his flotilla is not in a good position at this point, and his crew also becomes suspicious. In fact, Columbus becomes so afraid that he starts to fake the numbers that are in his log, so that the crew doesn't realize just how far away from land they are. Eventually, however, the crew demand that Columbus set a time when he's going to turn around, and sail back for home, sail back for safety. They say up until this point, everyone had sailed along the coast, stayed close to land, could have put into land if things got difficult. We've taken this very risky approach of sailing due west, and it's not paying off. So Columbus agrees that on the 33rd day of the voyage, no land has been sighted, they will turn back. And it's on the 32nd day that land is sighted, land that will become known as the Americas. And so the Americas missed out on being discovered by about a day. And this is supposed to have been, or suggested that this is the sort of site, this is the sort of landscape that Columbus and his crew would have seen. And I think it's worth emphasizing it gives you an idea of the size and the scope of the American continents as they confronted European explorers for the first time. The size of the mountains, the size of the rivers, all of this, generally speaking, would have been bigger than what they had experienced in Europe. So Columbus has discovered the Americas. We're not going to talk about, or I'm not going to talk about, the conquest of the Americas at this time. But I am going to talk a little bit about the importance of these discoveries. So this is the beginning of what's known as the Columbian Exchange. We're going to see the Spanish, and to a lesser extent the Portuguese, more and more involved in this, what they're going to call the New World. More and more involved in North and South America. And how will this impact the history of the world and the history of Western civilization as we understand it? Well, you can see from this map that there are a large number of new types of food, crops, animals that are now going to be accessible both to Europeans coming from the Americas to Europe, and that are going to be accessible to people living in America that are coming from Europe and from Asia. We're going to see new reserves of precious metals that are going to be added to the European economies. We're going to see new converts to Christianity. We're going to see Christianity become the largest religion in the world as a result of these changes, which had not been the case previously. We're also going to see death by disease, widespread death by disease. We're going to see exploitation through the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. All these are important legacies of the Age of Discovery. Even more broadly than that, the Age of Discovery is going to radically reshape the place of Europe and the place of Western civilization in the world. Up until this point, basically without exception throughout history, civilizations in Europe were poorer, were less stable, were less sophisticated than civilizations in the Middle East, or civilizations further east in China, civilizations in Africa, and civilizations in parts of the Americas. And so the Europeans, kind of like Vasco da Gama and his crew in Mozambique, are confronted by a truly new world. A new world that's much larger and much more varied than the world they had come to understand before. And so they, on one hand, are discovering that they are less sophisticated and less established than the civilizations they're encountering over here. On the other hand, they're discovering that they are perhaps more powerful, more sophisticated than some of the civilizations that they're discovering over here. And so it places these people in a very interesting position at the beginning of the 16th century, right around 1500. Are they going to be people who influence the world, who shape the history of the world? Are they going to be shaped and influenced by other civilizations that they are coming in contact with for the first time? And so what we're going to see in the next centuries is that European civilization is going to surge ahead. We're going to see that many of the ideas of European civilizations, ideas about law, ideas about religion, ideas about technology, ideas about education, which today are accepted as commonplace in many parts of the world, in many parts of the world are seen as highly valuable, that these are spread to the rest of the world, that these become common currency for the rest of the world as a result of the age of discovery. And this in itself, as if I can take you back to the first part of the lecture, this in itself is a product of the curiosity of medieval culture, of the culture of literacy, of the Renaissance, and of exposure to other parts of Asia during the medieval period. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you've enjoyed looking a little bit about the history of this topic. I hope that if you are interested, you'll join us at Easton. This is kind of a nice topic to introduce you to the program, because we have classes in both European history before this period and European history after this period, and American history as shaped by this period. So we have a lot of options for you here. I hope that this topic has given you a good taste of what there is to offer, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you.